Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you all. This is your host, Amina Ahmed, and you're watching Muslim Network TV. Welcome back to another episode of NextGen, and this week's theme of young people on the ground who are making some changes and impacting our world positively. We're actually going live for the second time today. We went live at 1 Central Time, and here we are again for the second time. This is the first time in the show's history that we're doing something like this, and it's to accommodate a special guest that we have with us today. We're there on Galaxy 19 satellite, MuslimNetwork.tv, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and soon on Apple TV as well. Now, 2 years ago in March, we saw a movement, right? The March for Our Lives movement of young students organizing to support policy and legislation that's preventing gun violence. We're seeing those same activists rise in the Black Lives Matter movement, and these protests, obviously, in the Black Lives Matter movement are still going on, although the media isn't covering them. We're seeing a rise of something else as well. Performative and passive activism, where we see people tweeting a hashtag Black Lives Matter and a black box, which is all arguably good in terms of raising awareness. But aside from that, it isn't doing much. A glamorization of activism is what's taking place right now. And, the guest that we're having today said something profound, that we need to stop glamorizing activism, that fighting for your basic human rights and decency should not be glamorized. And indeed, our guest today, Daud Mumin, was absolutely correct when saying that we need to stop glamorizing activism. Daud, thank you for being with us today.
Amina, thank you so much for having me. I am so excited to be speaking with you all. This is such an amazing platform to, really engage in the conversations that are so pertinent and so real in our everyday lives. So again, thank you so much for having me.
No, thank you. It's an honor for us to have you. Daud Mumin is a first-generation Somali Muslim American. He has been involved in, fighting gun violence because it's affected his life and those around him. He's also a former Youth Congress Equity and Inclusive Chair and a current board member of the March for Our Lives movement. In the broader picture, he hopes to address the larger government issues that are affecting the most vulnerable, the poor communities, the Black and brown communities that we're seeing currently. Daud Mumin, you're doing some phenomenal work.
Stop, you flatter me too much. Stop.
No. Like seeing other young activists doing, some work, being out there at the ground and affecting policy is always so nice to see.
Yes.
Now, Daud, I want to know, more about you, your background, your family. I know you come from an immigrant family. Tell us more about that and how that's gotten you to where you are today.
Yeah. So my parents emigrated from Somalia in 1996 to Salt Lake City, Utah. It was a very, very interesting choice nonetheless. But it was, something that has spurred, a great conversation. And also a very large part of my identity is being Black and Muslim and first generation in America, and being in first Black generation in a very homogenous state like Salt Lake City, Utah. I come from a family of 9 siblings. So I'm one of 10. So we were a football team of friends, and we have built a bond to stand by each other, stand with each other, and really think through what it means to be one of a few families at the time that were Muslim and Black and in America. So I think it's just we come from a family that really emphasizes the point of serving others, being there for others. Like, so many people were there for my parents and helped them move here and help them be prosperous here. And I think, quickly from a very, very young age, before I can even articulate words, I noticed the differences that I exhibited, right, as being Black, as being Muslim, as being low income, right? Those things, right, from a very young age were noticeable attributes that were different from the kids that I went to school with, the kids that I talked to, right? And actually, a little fun fact is, in 2005, I moved to Cairo, Egypt for 5 years. And I lived there for 5 years. Those my parents' mini vacation, as they call it, and came back in 2010, right? But when I grew up, I learned that the reason why we moved there was because of the everyday injustices happening against Muslims in America post 9/11, right? How Islamophobia became something that's exacerbated. And So, from when I passed my English, second language test when I was 12 years old, I dove right into this work. I've been an activist for almost 6 years now, starting off when I was 13, just, handing out water bottles at protests, going to city hall meetings, doing whatever I could to engage in the conversation, right? I live by this motto of learn and then join the fight, right? And that's really something that I live by. So when I was from a very young age, I didn't know what the problems were. I didn't know what how the world was such a dark place at times. So I realized I was like, it's my job to learn. And so my parents quickly supported that sort of dream, but obviously every first generation parent wants their kids to, have safe and secure futures, being a doctor and engineer and things of that nature. And I decided that taking the unprecedented, move forward, but also taking the stance forward that my community needs from me, right? The leadership that my community needs from me. So yeah, that's kind of how I got into activism. Just caring enough is how it all got started.
So you think, honestly, everyone should probably get involved? I think as young activists, we hear that label of like, oh, so now you're trying to be an activist. And it's like, shouldn't we all, right? Shouldn't we all try to
Yeah, exactly.
I hear that a lot, especially from, I don't know, it's like a snarky little comment, but those are the type of things that obviously add up. But, Dawood, would you say there was a defining moment that kind of led to your activism, or was it just your whole life?
Yeah, I would say it's a combination of both, right? I think, you can relate to this, that our identities in itself is a revolutionary act, right? Mm-hmm. Our existence in the classroom, in the public spaces, in our private homes, in our places of worship is something motivational, revolutionary, but also something that is an act of fighting back. But I think something that really opened my eyes up to the world is when I was 13 years old, right? I just cared. That's why I did the work, is because I wanted to learn more. I wanted to see why there was levels of injustices, right, that were systemic. Obviously 13-year-old me didn't think that, but right, it was wanting to learn more. Then when I was 14 years old, a really close classmate of mine actually lost his life to gun violence. And I think that was a very pivotal moment in understanding that this is an everyday issue. Injustice is not something you see on the news. Injustice is not sensationalized. Injustice is not, just spur of the moment. Injustice is every day. It's mundane at this point, right? So I had to start thinking through, what can I do? Right? What's my part in the fight? Right? Because for the first year, right, until I was 15 years old, I felt hopeless. I felt lost. I felt like everything that I did led to nothing, right? And then sort of the Black Lives Matter movement, the movement of, hope, of liberation, of justice, right? It began teaching me that it's not about what you can do. It's about what we can do together, right? And how those conversations shift, and can build that movement, right? And it's about collectivity, not individuality, right? It's thinking about, what can we all do? What can we all bring to the table, right? We have artists in our fight. We have speakers in our fight. We have organizers in our fight, right? We have strategists in our fight. We have communications in our fight, right? So what can you do to come to the fight, which has always been one of my pillars, right? It's not about what we want to do. It's about what has to be done, and fight there, right? I think that was sort of the pivotal moment, was when I realized that this is every day. This is something so normalized, right? And we have to continue taking the effort to fight back against it.
Yeah, and Dawood, you speak about how your Muslim identity, how your Somali and Black identity, how all of that coming together inspired your activism. But you also say something, very interesting. You say that in order to examine those identities, your Muslimhood informs your Blackness, and your Blackness informs your Muslimhood. What does that mean, Dawood?
Yeah, I think for me, right, intersectionality, right, is not about just a never-ending list of identities that we, exhibit or have, right? It's a theoretical activist framework built, thinking through Angela Davis, talking about how our identities inform each other, right? But also, how do those informations manifest a unique experience, right? Mm-hmm. Being Black and Muslim is way different than being Black and being Christian, or being Muslim and a different race, right? Mm-hmm. So it's the conversations about, what do my identities bring together, but also, right, how are my identities not separate, but instead they're a conglomeration, right? They bring one person, right? My entire strain of identities bring Daud Mumin, right? It's not about I'm Black and Muslim and, first generation. It's about I'm Black, Muslim, first generation, right? It's about those identities, how they are interlocked, right? They're not separable, right? And how they affect things like classism, ableism, right? Socioeconomic disparities, disenfranchisement, things of that nature, right? And so it's really important to think through how our identities bring about a unique fight. And the importance of that, Amina, is that, right, it allows us to take a good approach, but also one that was well conceptualized, because we now understand where it is, right? Our identities as Muslims, you and I, Amina, is completely different. They're completely different, right? You as a visibly Muslim hijabi girl, right? You have differences, experiences that I'll never be able to experience, right? But then there's also, again, flip side, things that you'll never have to experience, or things that you never may experience. And I think that is what's really important, is understanding that we're not exempt from, you know, self-actualization, right? That's really an important part of the fight, because now we understand who we are going into it.
Yeah. And I think that it's beautiful that you say all of these identities aren't separate. Rather, they come together to make, you know, whether that be me, Amina, or you, Dawood, right? So that truly is profound. But you also speak of classism. And in a lot of your work, you bring up the English language. And I think that's a very unique point. You bring up how the English language and being well informed in it, well written, well versed, always equates to being intelligent. And I think as first generation immigrants, we can both, I see you nodding along, and I know that you know where this is going, but how can we create a platform and a world, right, where English isn't equated to intelligence?
Exactly, right? I always tell people, the next person's calling me articulate, I'm just gonna ask why. You know?
Yeah.
I'm gonna ask why, because so many of our experiences, we don't dig deeper into, we don't ask, why did you say that? Why did you call me articulate? Why did you call me well-spoken, right? Because I'm pretty sure the person that you just interviewed before me that happened to be white was not given that same compliment, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I think when we make language inaccessible, right? That's my biggest thing. When we make language inaccessible, we make the fight inaccessible. We make the liberation of our people inaccessible, right? Because Paulo Freire, an Italian philosopher, explains that liberation and revolutionary leadership is not about leading for, it's about leading with. Mm-hmm. And if the people don't even understand how we're leading, how are they going to be in the fight, right? So I always tell people, it's not about our, you know, different dialects or approaches to English. It's not about standardizing English. It's about making English accessible. It's about making English being reflective of the time, right? I saw this thing the other day that talked about how a lot of low-income people do practice very leftist ideologies, but can't put them into words, can't theorize them. Why? Because they've been stripped of the words to do so. They've been stripped of the vocabulary to do so, right? Because we think of people, if they're not given 10-syllable words, that they're not explaining enough, right? No, that's not true, right? I like to take a very simple and very universal approach to language, where language is a very, you know, personal thing, right? Speaking Arabic, speaking Somali, right? It's a very personal thing to me, right? But when language disenfranchises a group, it no longer becomes as wholesome, right? Now it becomes violent, right? I always tell people English is a colonial language. English is a violent language. English is a language that often is imposed, not chosen to learn, right? You know, growing up, when I was learning Arabic in Egypt, it was something I cherished, something that I valued. It was something that I was excited to do because, right, it was something that was personal. And I think that is the same thing with when I had to learn English, right? It was like, here you go, survival of the fittest, right? You know, I was told I wouldn't get opportunities if I wasn't well spoken. I was told I wasn't going to get into the right places if I wasn't spoken. So I think that's important, that language needs to be accessible so that the fight can be collective, right? So we're not separated by words.
Yeah, and let's be honest, it's not a very pretty language, you know, because it was the language of our colonizers. You know, I'm Indian originally. It's a language we have to learn, but it is not beautiful compared to, you know, Hindi and Urdu and Arabic. These languages are, honestly, they speak to your soul, but then you have English and it's a different story.
Not me.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm just gonna be very open about it's a very ugly language, right? Let's be honest. But I have heard that a lot. That you're articulate, you're well spoken, but that same thing won't be said to the white activists that spoke right before me. So I agree with you on that. But Dawood, you know, currently with the Black Lives Matter protests, I know you're very involved in those protests. It seems that, you know, to some, it was just a trend that it's going away, right? We saw those black boxes that one day, and then now it's just gone, right? And even with those hashtags and black boxes, you know, I was speaking about this with another activist, how a lot of that is very performative. If you're not doing anything more, what's the value of that? So I want you to talk to us about this, right? What is the value in all of this? Is this just being seen as a trend by many who it doesn't affect personally?
Yeah. And I start off with that thing. Unfortunately, I don't have enough Oscars to give out, right? We don't have time for acting. We don't have time for people to not care enough, right? And I think that the goal isn't to just make it a trend or to, bash on people, but instead it's to give everyone an opportunity to know that we can shift the narrative, that we can make activism a sustainable fight. We can make activism a long life journey, right? Activism is not even something that you be burnt out by in a few months, right? Activism can be something we do for a long time. We read about so many amazing activists and organizers that do amazing work because, right, they were able to find ways to do it sustainably for a long time. And I think that's what's important, is how can we make sure that this fight doesn't end because there's not enough attention on it, right? How can we shift power away from the media and give it back to the people, right? Because trends are owned by networks, by companies, by people, right? They're monetized. So how can we take away that power and give it back to the people that need that power in their hands to deliver the fight?
Yeah, and Daud will be speaking more on your work with the March for Our Lives movement and what those alongside you are doing right after our short break. You're watching us on Galaxy 19 satellite, MuslimNetwork.tv, Amazon Fire TV, Roku, and soon on Apple TV as well. We'll be right back. I'm here with young activist and organizer Daud Mumin. Daud, you are also a key part in the March for Our Lives movement. Tell us about what work has been done by that movement, ever since the Parkland shooting, and what is your involvement in it?
Yeah, so the March for Our Lives, the goal of March for Our Lives really is to take an intersectional and equitable approach to gun violence prevention and violence prevention, right? How do we understand that violence is not something that is individual, but it's systemic, right? How do we think about gun violence in relation to poverty, in relation to homelessness, in relation to education, in relation to patriarchy, into capitalism, colonialism, ideas, right, that are so much larger, because we think of gun violence as a symptom of these larger structural issues, right? How do we think of police violence, right, as a symptom of gun violence? And the work that March for Our Lives is doing is to continue sort of working through the narrative of everyday, right, violence, right? How do we denormalize that, right? Because we still think we so often point to the world-renowned Chicago as the epicenter of global violence, right? But we don't think through, right, what are the sort of factors that have led to that, not only media-wise, but systemically, right? Well, let's talk about the education in Chicago. Let's talk about the education, in so many parts of the country that are facing such, horrible situations that, students are resorting to violence. Students are resorting to, things that they don't want to do, right? Violence is not optional, it's forced, right? Violence is something that we're pushed into. And I think, we often think about, right, we have to reposition our understanding of violence as everyday, right? Violence is lack of education. Violence is lack of healthcare, right? And that's sort of the goal that March for Our Lives takes. But also another thing that March for Our Lives wants to do is how do we continue supporting and uplifting, grassroots organizations? Our partnership with CJAF Action Fund is about how do we go to the everyday level of what everyone is going through, right? As one of the largest DVP organizations in the country, arguably the world, right? We have to take an everyday look and understanding to what is happening on the ground. And I think March for Our Lives is looking towards a future that is hopeful, it's safe, and it's loving, right? Activism is not about this larger theoretical system only, right? It's about the everyday impacts of justice, right? How can we return children to their parents? How can we make sure that, parents don't lose children to everyday violence? How can we make sure that we're not letting people, die because of lack of insulin, right? Things of that nature, right? It's an everyday, how do we restore humanity, right? And I think that's what March for Our Lives' goal is, and we take the route of gun violence.
Yeah. And though many of the critics of March for Our Lives, though, will say that, there wasn't enough focus on gun violence in the Black community. And then you had these white activists who some of them come from a very, a prosperous background. They can't really relate to that immigrant struggle, or let's say that Black and brown struggle. But these were the activists that were raising their voices. And then we had attention, seen to these communities. So people are complaining about the lack of intersectionality. What do you say to that?
See, I think one of the most important things in activism is understanding that criticism is important, right? It moves us forward, right? And what more than that, right? It helps us be better in our fight. Right. I think the goal isn't for March for Our Lives to act like we're a soundproof organization that's never done anything wrong. Right. It's important to understand that we're all capable of causing harm. We're all capable of doing wrong. We're also all capable of moving forward. Right. As the former equity and inclusion chair for March for Our Lives, one of my main goals was to address the internal and external effects of lack of intersectionality and inclusiveness of March for Our Lives. Right. But also we had to internally admit our wrongs. Right. We had to internally heal. We had to internally provide resources to those harmed by March for Our Lives' mission of ending gun violence, right? But also not allowing people to come to the forefront, but also March for Our Lives, right, has now increased our standard of that we will not tolerate those that are ignorant, those that are not intersectional, those that are not inclusive in their approach to liberation, right? Because if we're going to talk about liberation as a collective effort, but then March for Our Lives not allowing for a collective demographic, right? It's counterproductive, and quite frankly, it's harmful to our fight, right? So March for Our Lives has acknowledged our harms, has acknowledged our wrongdoing, but I think now we're fixing it. But also, that's the job of every activist, right? Is to be on a continual path of growth, of a continual path of becoming better, of doing better, and understanding that, if we exempt ourselves from injustice, we almost give ourselves a God complex, right? We almost give ourselves of a can do no harm. And that's not fair, right? Because harm is something that we're all capable of doing. So we all need to understand how we can circumvent harm in our everyday lives. And I think that's what March for Our Lives is doing, especially in this year.
Yeah. How are they, promoting intersectionality in their movement? I know that you said that they've acknowledged that they haven't been, too great at that, but obviously they're changing like every activist should. So what are some steps that they're taking?
Yeah, so there's a few things that are being done, right? First is staff education, right? It's important that our staff has a theoretical understanding of our work, right? The idea of praxis, which might be new to a lot of people, is the idea that we need to combine theory and practice, but what makes it cyclical is reflection, right? Mm-hmm. So how do we learn, reflect, take action, reflect, then learn, and do that till the end of time, right? And so March for Our Lives, right, has really instilled a pedagogical approach to our activism of teaching, right? Of learning, right? Of how can we give and take, right? How can we learn how can we learn from those on the ground, right? That's the first thing I would say is education. The second thing is it's important that if we want representative understanding of the fight, we have to have a representative demographic in our work, right? March for Our Lives has a youth congress that we build up of 25 activists from around the country that are from different ages, different genders, different sexual orientation, different, demographics, class, economics, whatever it may be, because, right, we need to take a multifaceted approach. We need to take a multi-perspective approach to gun violence, right? But also representation can always be proportional, right? March for Our Lives needs to have more Black and brown people in the fight because gun violence disproportionately affects brown and Black people, right? So I think that's the second thing that we're doing, right, is making sure that our representation is proportional so that our ideology and that our approaches to gun violence are proportional, but also are reflective of the fight and of the issue. The third thing that I would say is messaging, right? We need to be current, right? We need to be supportive, right? During the Black Lives Matter movement and protests all of May and all of June, and currently still, is our goal was to amplify and uplift, right? Our goal wasn't to interject ourselves into the fight, right? But instead it was to give resources to the fight, right? We equipped all of our organizers and all of our staff members with a to-do list of things that they can do to support the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Because at the end of the day, it's not about being at the forefront, but it's like I said before, it's about knowing where you're needed and fighting there, right? March for Our Lives has a platform. March for Our Lives has resources, whether it's monetarily or otherwise. So we need to find ways that we can give that to others and help others and uplift others, right?
Yeah, it's definitely not, this raising our voice for the voiceless. It's amplifying the voices that have existed for centuries in this country in particular. Daud, how have you dealt with backlash? I know you get a lot of that. Tell me how you've been able to deal with that from people who are saying that gun violence is not even an issue in this country.
Yeah. Again, I always have to differentiate what's criticism and what is outright rude and blasphemous and violent, whatever it may be, right? So I always think if it's criticism, listen, right? Learn and understand. Go back to the drawing board, right? I always tell people, go back to the drawing board, learn more, right? Read a new book, right? You find a problem, Google it, right? I think that's my biggest thing. Criticism is so essential to our work, but also I think criticism is an act of love, right? It shows that I care about you, Amina, right? I care about you enough to tell you that you're wrong so that you can grow alongside and be in the fight, right? But then backlash, on the other hand, is something I've dealt with for a long time, and it's something that I've definitely learned to handle. But also, right, it's that backlash is not random. Like a lot of things aren't random, right? Backlash comes from somewhere. It comes from an insecurity. It comes from violence. It comes from not wanting to learn more, right? So you just have to learn. You have to always, I guess, each, kind of hate comment, as some might say, or violence or death threats, as some might say to some extremes, is, right, you have to deconstruct it, right? Is it a lack of knowledge? Is it defensiveness? Is it, and what do they actually mean? When people really DM me and talk about, I'm gonna shoot you with my gun before you can take it, right? I always think about it and I'm just like, they think I'm trying to take their gun, right? So let's work backwards. I'm not trying to take your gun. I'm actually trying to make sure that you have a right to a gun. But also I'm trying to make sure that those that do not have right to a gun are being safe, are being and right, and we're reducing harm, right? Gun violence isn't about gun safety necessarily, right? Those are two separate ideologies. Gun violence is about reducing the harm caused by a gun, but also addressing the symptoms that allow that to happen. So I would say always be critical of what people are actually saying to you and what it looks like they're saying to you, and then go from there, and don't take anything personally, right? We're not in this fight to boost our own ego. So when someone comes for your ego, don't let it be a reflection of your work, right? We're in this fight to liberate ourselves and our future generations, right? We're doing the work continuously of our ancestors and those that come before us. So what's one little hate comment?
Right. I think it's better to just laugh at it. And that's something that I definitely do. Like, you seem a lot more enlightened with the way that you handle it. You take it back to its roots, maybe even have a constructive conversation with hate comments. Personally, I'll just laugh it off.
Oh, there are those, especially yesterday was a frenzy on my social media. They had fun with me yesterday. Yeah, and I was just like, I'm not taking this personal, Like when people say that they don't like me and things of that nature, I'm like, I get it.
It's like, it's okay. Sometimes I feel you, like, we actually, we had someone on our, when I was promoting the episode, and I know your friend David Hugg also promoted it. Someone was like, "Oh, look at you, identity politics again," and I was like, I just had a good laugh.
It happens, right? And I think that's like what I'm saying. It's just like, right, when we realize that we're not in this fight to strengthen our pride, right? We're in this fight to strengthen our communities. We're in this fight to strengthen our longevity, right? So that is what I always tell people. It's just like, just laugh about it and move on. But sometimes there's a little more nuance to those comments, right? Sometimes there's a little something more to explore, right? And sometimes there's worth people just talking to, sometimes there's worth people. I'm not gonna talk to a page that says July 2020 they joined Twitter. Like, of course I know you're a troll page, right? But there's some people that, right, they're misinformed, right, and just need a push. Right. That's what our fight is about. Our fight is about bringing people in. It's about calling people in. Right. It's not about calling people out necessarily. It's about how do we reduce harm that they may be able to do? And sometimes that means extending an olive branch, right? And just saying, come and join us in our fight. So that's sometimes what I would say.
Yeah, and Dawood will be speaking more on how we can extend, our arms to those who want to join our fight and the importance of young people and getting involved right after our short break. I'm here with Daud Mumin, and we'll be right back. Welcome back to Next Gen. I'm your host, Amina Ahmed, and I'm here with the young activist, Daud Mumin. Now, Dawood, why is the voice of young people so important, not just in the activist field, but just in virtually every space that, young people we exist, right? Why is it so important?
I think what's really important about young people's voice is that, right, it's not necessarily about it's a young person speaking. It's about the fact that there is a young person willing to step up and voice their concerns, voice their opinions, right? But also, again, it goes back to the whole language thing. Since when did age all of a sudden equate to this deservingness to speak up, right? As a 19-year-old, I've probably been through a lot more than some people in this world can only imagine going through, right? So it's about what can we bring to the fight, but also it's so important to understand that activism is an intergenerational struggle, right? But also it's an intergenerational movement, right? We need people that are 80 some years old, but we also need people that are as young as 10 years old, right? Being there alongside us, right? Because systemic violence sometimes doesn't care about age, right? So it's about how can we all come to the table collectively, right? But I also think young people, what's really important about young people is that we provide a fresh set of eyes and a unique perspective, right? But also a unique energy in the fight, right? We bring a passion that sometimes is needed. We sometimes bring a passion that doesn't exist. And I think that is what's really important, is that this national conversation about gun violence, this national conversation about Black Lives Matter has been consistently driven by everyone, right? So I think, why is everyone not at the table? So I think, people like Patrisse Cullors, founder of Black Lives Matter, right?
I think we're experiencing some technical difficulties. Dawood, your screen is frozen.
Can you hear me?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, sorry. I think the most important thing has been realizing that our fight is collective, and young people bring something new. They bring a new energy to learn, a new energy to fight, a new energy to grow, and I think, right, a new energy to move the torch forward, right? I think some people that have come before us, they deserve a break, right? So I think, how can we do our part to continue the momentum, right? But also, as time moves forward, right, there are some things that we know better, right? We know how to market ourselves on social media better. We know how to utilize social media as a tool. We know how to use, platforms, and we know how to build platforms, right? So how can we provide that insight to the fight? Again, going back to my very big principle, young people are needed somewhere, and they're going to fight there. And if we don't want them to, the fight is missing a key part. And I think that is what we need to understand.
Yeah, I always say it's the passion of the young people and the guidance of elders that gets us to accomplish, the goals that we're looking to. Dawood, speaking of accomplishments, I want to talk about yours. What is one of your most proudest moments and all of the things you've done? Your bio is too large for me to fit in our introduction. So I want you to tell me your most, biggest accomplishment, or one that's the most dearest to you.
Yeah. I'm going to give two, because I think you're going to say, that's not an accomplishment for the first one. But I think the first one is, I think my biggest accomplishment every day is giving someone hope, right? I think that is always my biggest accomplishment, is when someone is inspired by what I've done. That is something that's so validating. It's so, heartwarming for someone to DM me and they're like, I did this today because of you, right? Because of me, they did that, right? And I think that is such an important part of the conversation, right? That someone is quite literally looking at you, right? Your actions don't go unnoticed, right? So that use them carefully, right? I think that is something that's so beautiful to me, is people realizing that, oh, if the Oud can be in the fight, why am I not? Why am I not in the fight? Why am I not in the movement, right? So I think it's about shifting the narrative that this fight's inaccessible. And I think that's what really builds me up, is that when people want to fight with me, want to fight alongside me, I think that is really, really hopeful to me. And also it's really inspiring, right? It validates long nights, early mornings, right? It validates bruises and, protesting and sunburns and all of those things, right? And it brings us a moment of, this is going somewhere, right? This is moving the needle forward, right? When someone says they read this book because I suggested it, right? And they learned just a little bit more about the struggle, right? I would say that that's my biggest accomplishment.
Yeah, you said that I would disagree with that. I totally agree with that. I think
So
that when you
often
put
people are
that,
like,
it,
okay, what about something? I'm like, but that really is, it's like, it really is
it
something that,
really,
that's what I do it for, right? It's that people need that light to move forward to. And Angela Davis talked about this, right? People need to move forward knowing that the light is there, but they even don't see it, right? So how can we be that light for each other, right? Even though we don't see liberation just yet, how can we be the needle towards it? How can we be the people that move it just a little bit closer to that goal, to that end, world where, it's perfect and it's for us, not against us.
yeah, and I love how you quote Angela Davis. I think it was your second time doing that, and every time, it's like she's an
I
absolute,
read way too many of her work to
oh
not
yeah,
quote.
she's phenomenal. And I think that, she's literally the example of, inspiring young people. We have Dawood, who has the passion of the young people, and then Angela Davis, who gives the guidance of those who are older than us. But Dawood, during COVID-19, how have you been able to sustain and continue your activism?
Yeah. I think one of the most important things about activism, right, is that it's not, it has to be current, right? Activism has to be kept up and activism has to be remodeled, right? So I think one of the biggest things in COVID-19 that taught us is the power of digital organizing, right? The power of collectivity without even being next to each other, right? It's the power of, right? But I also think it's pointed out an inequity in activism, right? Not everyone has access to social media. Not everyone has access to technology. Not everyone has access to the ability to do things like this, right? So I think about, I learned this from, one of my mentors, and he says the work that we do is not always about building a perfect world, but it's about how do we build perfectly, right? How do we see the problems in its entirety, right? How do we uncover? How do we expose, right? Abolitionism is not about just ending systems. It's about examining systems, right? It's about seeing them in its entirety, right? And I think that is what's really taught me how to, build during COVID-19. But, right, I think what's really also, forced me and to challenge me to rethink is, Audre Lorde, she talks about how do we, dismantle the master's house without using the master's tools, right? How do we think of outside these systems that we're so ingrained in, that are so systemic in our lives, that they become normal, right? That they become impossible to deviate from, right? I think that was a challenge in COVID, is what can we do to start imagining systems differently? How can we start imagining worlds differently, right? It's a privilege to say that COVID allowed me the opportunity to reflect, because so many people are, dying and struggling through it. But I think, so many of us had the opportunity to sit at home and think and reflect. And I think that was the biggest thing, is I think going into the rest of my fight and the rest of my long life fight, it's been about what can I do to always move forward, right? And I think COVID challenged a lot of us, because a lot of us thought, oh, activism's taking a little break. We said, no. How can we make activism digital? How can we make organizing digital? How can we educate each other digitally, right? How can we build mutual aids? How can we give to each other? How can we pool resources, right? Because at the end of the day, we will liberate ourselves, right? So why wait on someone else to do it?
That's profound, right? We will liberate ourselves Why wait on someone else to do it? And I think that even with just young people, we're starting to create platforms for ourselves to get resources from those who are, willingly giving it to us. Because for far too long, we do complain that we aren't given enough resources and enough platforms. But why not create those ourselves? So that's absolutely profound what you said. But Daoud, how does someone like you find time to rest and kind of, just in the middle of all of this? I know you're always out there, you're always at the forefront of these things. And if you're not, you're amplifying those voices that are. So how do you find time to relax?
Absolutely. When I find it, I will. Just joking. I think one of my biggest, sort of moments in this work is realizing that rest is activism. Rest is revolutionary. Rest is radical, right? Because it allows us to be sustainable. It allows us to be soldiers that are ready, that are fueled, right? It's the model of, if you take 5 minutes to go to the gas station to fill up your car, you can go further, right? But if you keep trying to drive on E, you're not going to get far. You might break down. You might, it'll cost you, right? So I always tell people that's the same way. Treat yourself like it needs to be re-energized. Treat yourself like a resource that is not forever, right? So think about how can you, take that extra hour to just sit and read, take an extra hour to mentally take care of yourself, right? Because self-care isn't always about face masks and massages and things of that nature, right? Face masks sometimes for me is about going to the park and just reading. Sometimes it's about taking 30 minutes to actually eat a good meal, right? Sometimes for me, an hour of just talking to a friend about nothing important is self-care for me, right? So I always tell people self-care is individualized, right? There's not a one-size-fits-all model, but also invest in it. It is an investment that you will reap many benefits from, right? In June, to be honest, I didn't take care of myself, right? But that was because April and May I was. So I had the energy to keep going during June, right? I always tell people, if you keep yourself taken care of, you're able to come close to that threshold. But if you're not, you're going to cross it, right? And that might have severe, adverse effects on your livelihood. So that's why I was able to have long nights and early mornings and marching every day, but also maintaining a job and this and that, because, I knew that one day I'll need that energy. One day I'll need that reserve of power that I, had. And also I would tell people nutrition is so important. Take care of your body, right? Because your body is literally what is keeping you moving, right? And it's about how do you nourish your mind, right? How do you nourish your body? That's another thing that, right, makes activism inaccessible. So many people don't have the energy to do it because sometimes they don't have the resources to be energized, right? And again, right, these systems that exist, their goal is to stifle us, right? So we need to continue finding ways to energize, right? And we need to continue finding ways to stay strong, because I always tell people, oppressive powers are going to get smarter, are going to get more technical, are going to get more difficult to fight against. So we need to also get stronger. We need to get smarter. We need to get better, and we need to get bigger, right? And if I'm burnt out, there's just one less person in the fight. So think about yourself as an important piece of the puzzle. And if that piece of the puzzle has disappeared, we can't complete it. So take care of yourself, nourish your body, nourish your mind, do fun stuff, smile, be joyful, right? That's the thing, is I always tell people, once the oppressor has taken away our joy, they've won, right? Once they've stripped us away from our humanity, they've won, right? So find ways to connect, find ways to be happy, right? In the capitalist system, find some way to be happy, please. Enjoy something, right?
Best economy. I think that's the response of what a lot of our viewers is going to be. Yeah, for sure.
Something and be happy about something.
Yeah, the activists that are watching, at least be happy that we're in a very revolutionary moment right now. I think that's something that does bring me a lot of joy currently. But Daoud, before we end here, I want to get your final piece of advice, your final message to our audience who wants to get involved just like you, who perhaps wants to take that inspiration from you, and maybe that's that can add on to your biggest accomplishment, like you said.
You can just add on to my biggest accomplishment every day. My biggest piece of advice is, you are needed. It is never too late, and there is no action too small, right? I always tell people to learn, right? Pick up a book, read, Google, right? We're not discovering, right, new things. We're just uncovering them, right? So don't burden yourself with the responsibility that doesn't need to exist, right? Take the time to talk with people, right? Take the time to learn from people. And I think I think that the thing that's kept me going is take inspiration from the fact that you are doing something, right? But you can always do more, right? That is what always keeps me going, is knowing that, yes, this was good. I'm glad that I had conversations with Amina. Now what is next, right? I always tell people it's not about never being satisfied, but it's about knowing that the fight is not over yet. And I think once we continue, right, you can be 30 years old and have never voted, right? But that's fine. But if you start doing it, right? That's why I always tell people activism is about addressing the harms of the past and bettering them and then moving forward from them, right? And once we're able to do that, once we're able to realize that, hey, you know, it's been 20 years of my life and I didn't realize capitalism was a bad thing. That's okay. Some of us have, but you haven't. That's okay, right? Now it's time for you to pick up a book. Now it's time for you to read, right? And as much as hopeful as I like to be, I like to be straightforward. This is your responsibility. If you're not with us, you're against us. If you're not in the fight, you are actively violent in the fight, right? So I always tell people it's not to guilt you, but it's just to make you realize that this world isn't always about choices. Sometimes some of us have to do this work. Some of us have to survive, right? And the thing is once we realize that our own survival is interdependent on other people's willingness to keep us alive, then we realize that we're important and we matter and we need to be here.
Yeah. Indeed, it's a responsibility on all of us to educate ourselves. Like Daud said, go pick up a book, right? I think we should all be doing that.
Motto, go pick up a book. Go pick up a book.
Yeah.
You know,
we all need to be educating.
It's always important. It's always powerful when people choose knowledge over ignorance, right? Because ignorance is not blissful, it's violent, right? Yeah. Ignorance can be harmful. Ignorance is harmful. So how can we pick up a book and join the fight?
Daud, I'm going to steal that from you. Ignorance is not blissful, it's violent. I think that's going to be my new quote now. Thank you so much, Daud Mumin, for being with us. Thank you to all of our viewers for tuning in to this week on young people who are doing some groundwork, who are making some changes in our world. And until next week, take care, everyone. Assalamu alaikum. Peace be upon you all.